Hi, I'm Josh McGrath.
I'm Andrew Haas.
And this is the Ardent Pursuit Podcast. Today we are examining the sixth area of vision that we as men need to have each year in our lives. Today we are looking at being intellectual. So, Andrew, this one might make some of our viewers think, oh, we're gonna have a really, heady academic conversation about being intellectual. But really what we're discussing today is the importance of exercising your brain, because your brain is a muscle, and much like all the other muscles in your body, if you're not working it out, it becomes lazy, and it makes doing simple tasks like thinking much harder.
And it's something we've learned to do from an early age, or forced to do, which is great. And it, for some reason, generally tapers off in young adulthood.
And historically, like when you look back 200 years ago, young people, 13, 14, 15, were so much smarter than probably most of us ever will be. They were, taking Greek and Latin. They were learning German and French and Spanish. They had a very good working knowledge of like world history, economics, and theology. And shocker, they were either all homeschooled or self-taught. Yet today, we have many adults who don't understand even basic American history or basic economics, which has really contributed to the mess that we're in culturally.
Now, having access to every piece of information that we could want is not helping any. It's a huge blessing, but the big shadow side to this is that we've actually offloaded a lot of mental work and mental capacity to the technology around us. A small example, I remember probably early college, high school, I had a flip phone, thought I was cool.
Yeah.
And you had to input each number. And I inputted the 15 people that I knew, their numbers. I punched them in, hit save. I had my contact list, but I knew the numbers.
Yep.
And of course, it was fun seeing their number pop up in the caller ID. But I knew, I could get to from here to there. Didn't need a GPS.
Yeah.
Knew how to get around. And then when GPS came along, it was this amazing technology. It's like, whoa, look at this. It like tells you where to go, tells you when to turn. Loved it. Now, I don't know. I don't even think I know your number.
I don't know your number.
Yeah, it's like I just say like call Josh.
Exactly.
And it's crazy where technology has provided this amazing benefit, but at the same time, I actually don't use my brain as much.
And for men, it's very easy to not engage in an intellectual way, to challenge our brain to think intellectually because of the sheer amount of, entertainment that we can consume. We talked a couple weeks ago about the categories of, movies and TV shows, video games, music. It's so easy to just passively engage with all of that entertainment. And by and large, that entertainment does not engage our brains in an intellectual way. It's not engaging the cerebellum, which ironically, the only reason I know that is because I looked it up before the show. So again, relying on technology to help inform me. And men need to actively exercise the intellectual part of their brain. Otherwise, they're just going to be intellectually very lazy, which leads to a whole host of issues.
And one of the challenges for men is going to be knowing what type of effort to put into stewarding their minds. If you just know a bunch of sports scores, that's really not going to do much. And I would argue that, a Jeopardy contestant, they know a lot. And it's definitely paid off if you're a successful contestant. But does that serve them in day-to-day life? Possibly. But just be mindful of, is the effort that I'm putting in, is it making me to the person I want to be?
Sure. Knowing every single plot of every single Marvel film and every character in the Marvel universe, while that's impressive, probably not very practical or helpful. Still better than not exercising your brain intellectually, but absolutely understanding where you're putting that effort is important, because you don't want to simply do it in one area only, but to be engaged in multiple areas. And I think it's important that we recognize that we, particularly as believers, are called to be stewards of our mind. We have a responsibility as Christians to be informed about the issues of our day, to be engaged with the issues of our day, and have an answer to the issues of our day.
And that's a really good point. I think a good place for guys to start is knowing why you believe what you believe. Mm-hmm. Guys can quickly end up at different beliefs or opinions and be very opinionated or have very firm beliefs in things. But when you press them on it, hey, why do you believe that? Or, hey, how did you arrive at that opinion? Things can quickly become evident that there's not a whole lot backing it. And so, I would suggest that men start with figuring out, okay, why do I believe this? Or why do I have a strong opinion about this? And if that's not clear, put your mind to work and really figure out what's behind that.
So I want to move us into our first big area of focus today, which is curiosity. And there's really three components that we're going to explore today with regards to curiosity. It's interest, it's humility, and it's action. And so looking at the first area here, interest, one of the things that men tend to lack is an interest in the world around them. It's so easy for them just to live life, to view things, to hear things, to see things, to experience things, and just kind of be carried along the stream of life, the current of life, without being interested in why certain things are happening, why certain things are being said, why certain things exist.
I would argue that curiosity is a very important human trait. And to your point, men often become interested in, say, one or two things, mm-hmm. and they become very knowledgeable in that. And then for the rest of life, they basically show no or very little interest at all.
And it's just easy to not be interested in anything, to not be questioning things. I think about, politics and the fact that so much happens in the political realm, and it's not uncommon that men are uninformed with what's happening politically in our culture. And oftentimes it's just a lack of interest altogether. It's not they're willfully trying to avoid, learning about politics. There's just not an interest. There's not even a question regarding it. They're very content just to live life without knowing what's happening politically. And I would argue that as a citizen and as a Christian, it is our responsibility to be informed to the extent that is possible in order to steward the opportunities that lay before us as American citizens, as believers, but also as a nation. But you've got to have an interest of some kind. And it's so easy to just have no interest in most things.
Too often we are just the recipients and we take at face value what is presented before us. Whether it's the news channels, it could just be entertainment, mm-hmm. movies, podcasts, whatever it is, we like to just take it in, and we too often just will take something at face value and not ask why.
So curiosity, we're defining as having three components today. Interest, humility, and action. I want to look at this idea of humility, because why bring up humility when talking about curiosity? I think because it's important for anyone, but particularly for men, to be humble enough to recognize that they don't know X, Y, Z, and to be in a posture of learning, to say, I want to know, to learn from somebody else about X, Y, Z. It's not uncommon that, the hubris of men, the pride of men, where they like to think they know it all, the classic, I don't need to pull over and ask for directions, I know how to get there mantra. It's really good for men to position themselves in a place of humility that says, I don't know X, Y, Z, and I need to know X, Y, Z, which is the very nature and reason for authority and accountability. It's a place of humility by the man to say, I don't know everything. I do need wisdom. I do need counsel. I do need input from somebody else. And when it comes to being curious, if your curiosity is simply, that's interesting, asking a question, but not being humble enough to go find the answer from a source or from a person, you've missed out on the opportunity to grow in your knowledge and understanding and possibly skill set.
Yes, too often masculinity and humility are unfortunately at odds with each other. I don't think that is inherently the case. I think we make it the case. And as men, we often struggle with humility, and it's our job to lean into that. Just because it doesn't come naturally for a lot of us, just because it's not something that we think might benefit us, we need to lean into that and make that part of who we are.
I know that for me, I've kind of just defaulted to a place where I ask other people, questions or for advice, and at times to a detriment. I've definitely had people respond to me, particularly when it comes to questions. Why don't you just Google that? My computer's doing X, Y, Z. How do I fix that? Just Google it. And I'm like, but you're the expert, so I'm going to skip Google and go right to you. And part of being curious is being humble enough to recognize I need other people to help me. And one of the outcomes of hopefully being humble is that there's an action that comes with it where you're turning to someone or a source to learn something you didn't know or to gain a new skill that you didn't have.
And too often it can be intimidating or uncomfortable for a guy to go down that road, to lean into that area that he doesn't know much about and knows very little. And so we can be hesitant to even take action, to even show curiosity, to ask questions, because we realize, hey, we actually don't know a lot. And we think that's a problem, but more often than not, that's a totally fine place to start.
Yeah, we want to know everything up front before we start down that road, which is ironic because if we knew everything up front, we wouldn't need to go down that road.
Exactly.
I've taught piano for years, and the number of times I've had a student be frustrated that they have to be learning, stuff that they don't just know it. And I tell them all the time, I was like, if you knew this already, you would be the teacher and you wouldn't be sitting here with me. There's a reason you're sitting here with me. It's because you don't know it and you need to be taught it. I think about, the benefits of being curious and actually acting on that curiosity. I think back to, high school. I was really into, film. It was very basic at the time, very primitive, nothing like the technology we have today. And producer Ben and I would make, these fun little, high school films. And then throughout college, we would do, short videos in college. I made one after I wrote a Christmas song, again, a very primitive video. But we learned with the basic technology of the day how to make videos. And because we were just interested, we were curious. And spent a lot of time on YouTube watching other people who are experienced teach you how to do it. You're Googling a lot of answers, and then you're just a lot of trial and error. Now, fast forward 20 some odd years later, and we talked about starting a podcast. We knew we wanted to do a video podcast. And guess what? There was no learning curve to do a video podcast. We already knew all the video elements because for 20 some odd years, in dozens of different environments and projects, we had learned and grew in our understanding of film, of editing, that entire process. And I think, wow, what a benefit that we were curious back in high school about film, because while I never thought I would need the skills that would be honed by being involved in film, man, suddenly you want to do a video podcast, and it's like, all right, let's just do it. Well, we know the production aspect of film, and so it was a very easy transition into doing a video podcast.
And so often that is how things play out. For some reason, we don't make that jump. We think, I can't show curiosity, I'm hesitant, there's uncertainty, I don't know. But more times than not, if we go down that road, if we open our minds, if we work that muscle, we learn, we grow, we apply, we implement, and there's huge benefit that comes from that.
For sure. I mean, again, just another story time with Josh. I think about the fact that I did construction for many years. And so when it came time to build the set, we didn't hire somebody to build the set. We built the set. And it was not like how do we do this? We already had the knowledge and skill set because of the fact that we had had a history where we were curious about certain, construction projects. Now, in some cases, we were forced into that by our parents, and we didn't have a choice. You were going to do construction whether you wanted to or not. But what's so cool is, here we are sitting on a set that we designed, on a set that we built, because of ultimately some curiosity, and then learning from other people who had a skill set we did not have.
So with that, there are some cautions that we want to talk about. The first one being apathy. Apathy, or another word could be passivity, is something that all men everywhere will have to wrestle with and have to contend with. A lot of men don't realize it's present, and a lot of us do realize it's present. Either way, it's something that all men need to fight against and put active attention toward day in, day out to, we're never going to eliminate it. Apathy, passivity, it's always going to be there in some form. Our job is to remove it as much as we can from our lives.
Apathy is the poison to curiosity. And while you can be curious, it's very easy to be apathetic in your curiosity and never act on it. And because of just the ease of life that we enjoy today in our Western culture, we've talked about this before on the show, it is so easy to be apathetic about learning a new skill, about challenging ourselves intellectually, about learning more about the world around us, and to just exist in a perpetual state of ease and enjoyment. Ignorance truly is bliss. And for so many men, they have to fight against a natural inclination that says, don't care, be lazy, enjoy not working hard. And so one of the cautions that we're bringing to the forefront for men is be aware that your natural disposition is going to be apathetic towards the world around you, and fight against that to be intellectually curious.
And another caution we want to talk about is academic fallacy. Do you want to give us a quick definition of what that could look like?
So what we're examining here is this notion that to be intellectually curious requires you to be academically minded. One can be intellectually curious and learn about the world around them without being academically inclined. Not everyone, loves writing papers and reading long books and citing sources. Not everyone's going to be a public speaker. Not everyone gets excited about learning new facts about the world around them. That's okay, totally fine. But it doesn't mean that they can't be intellectually curious because perhaps they didn't go to college, perhaps they're not prolific writers, perhaps they're not brilliant mathematicians, perhaps they're not an engineer or a doctor. That's not a prerequisite to be intellectually curious. And so one of the things we want men to be aware of is there can be this tendency to disengage intellectually because you're like, I'm not really one of those academic bros. I didn't write a thesis. Well, what do I know? And it's like, well, don't sell yourself short. You can still learn regardless of your academic past or your inclination towards academics.
And on the flip side, there might be a caution here for men who have pursued a degree or 2 or 3, and they have attained a certain level of education, and that can give a false impression of being open-minded. And they're not the same. Much like you don't need a degree to be curious,
Yep.
Having a degree, I would say, wouldn't necessarily make you a more curious person. So if you are someone with a degree, just keep in mind that that by default doesn't necessarily make you a more curious, interested person. It can help toward that end, but those men still need to be very mindful to remain curious, remain open-minded.
That's an excellent point, which I think sets up the final caution well. And this caution we've titled the Renaissance Man. And for any of our listeners who are not familiar with it, a Renaissance man historically is a man who is well versed in history, economics, theology, a man who has understanding in many areas, a man who's interesting to converse with because of his knowledge of the world around him, someone who is insatiably curious about things. Doesn't matter if it's an area that he's an expert in or not. He's just curious, constantly wanting to learn. Now, the Renaissance man has oftentimes in our culture today been traded for the expert. And it's not either or. It's not either be an expert in a field or be a Renaissance man. It's both and. You can be both an expert and a Renaissance man. And one of the things that we want to caution our listeners is that don't avoid interest in multiple areas and in multiple topics simply because they're outside of your scope of either vocation or initial interest.
Yes, it is very important for men to be well-rounded, well-versed, educated, if you will, in many different areas. It could be in something small, it could be in something big, but men should purpose to grow and learn in a variety of different areas.
One of the interesting things about our culture is that we are just obsessed with, experts. Every day you've got the legacy media quoting some expert from who knows where. We saw this during COVID. Every expert and their neighbor, came out of the woodwork and suddenly were the sole authority on all things COVID. It's the classic, you're watching the Summer Olympics and now you're the expert on gymnastics and diving, even though you've never done either. And so there's that famous quote by Albert Einstein. He says, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. In reality, if you're intellectually honest, no matter how many degrees you have, no matter how many accolades you receive, you should come to recognize that the more educated I am, the more that I know, I actually know now how much I don't even know. There's that famous, Ralph Waldo Emerson quote. It says something like, every man I meet is my superior in some way. In that, I learn from him. The reality is that regardless of your academic background, you as a man have the opportunity to learn from the world around you. And that's the whole concept of being a Renaissance man. It's not saying don't be an expert. It's recognizing I don't know so much and I just want to learn more.
And if it isn't obvious, there are massive benefits for guys who put their mind and attention toward this.
Tons, yeah.
Toward being more curious, toward being more open-minded, toward learning. For starters, women will find you a lot more attractive.
Yes, women are attracted to men who are intellectually curious and who are actually learning about the world around them. One of the benefits of being intellectually curious is that you will likely amass a set of new skills in some way, shape, or form. I think about our friend Carson. He's a chemical engineer. That's what he went to school for, brilliant engineer. And when he wants to learn about something because he's intellectually curious, he becomes like a semi-expert in it. And I think about him wanting to fix his own car. And suddenly he's like a pro mechanic where he's got this whole engine apart and he's like fixing all the problems and putting it back together. And it just blows my mind that here's a guy who, never worked on a car a day in his life, gets a car, decides he wants to fix it, and somehow figures out how to fix the entire thing. But because he was curious and wanted to know, and because he's super smart because he's an engineer, he just applied himself, studied, watched videos, and then just went to town on his car and fixed it.
If that's not a template for all men to follow. And just to be clear, being a more attractive person is not your forefront primary objective.
No.
We're just saying that as you become well-rounded, as you become more curious, these are just some of the downstream effects. These are just some of the benefits. Purpose to be a more well-rounded person, a more curious person. Don't set out to be a more attractive person.
Sure.
These are the things that will happen as you purpose to be more curious, more open-minded.
And because we want to equip, men to be initiators of romantic relationships, one of the things that we want to equip you in is to be intellectually curious. And as a result, that will make you more attractive to women. One of the benefits to being intellectually curious is that it will oftentimes open doors for you, professionally or personally. I think about, my work and the fact that everything I've done in my professional career isn't because I was trained in it, but because I was curious, and so I learned. I was self-taught in it. I didn't go to school for anything that I do today. It was all just study and research myself because I was curious about it. And I think, wow, I went to school for music. Now, Lord knows that's always a bad decision for everybody. But what's funny is I'm like, I could have literally just skipped college, been intellectually curious, and possibly be where I am today solely because of my interest.
I mean, there is some truth in that. A lot of people will go very far and be very successful simply by keeping an open mind, asking good questions, being curious. That takes you really far.
Sure. Would you consider yourself an intellectually curious person?
I do try. And years ago, this is going way back, I was growing more and more dissatisfied or just uninterested with traditional media outlets. It was AM radio, oddly enough. Who even listens to that?
Is that?
Like,
I don't
not
think
even
that even exists.
We're talking AM radio. That's how hardcore I was.
Tinfoil hat fellow right here.
Well, there were some great programs on there, and
clearly not so great because I don't think AM exists. I don't even know where you find that on the dark webs. Is that like where you also hire murderers and nuclear weapons and listen to AM radio? It's like the one way that you can communicate with people without the government listening in. I love it. So you're an AM guy. All right, got it. Sorry, listeners. I didn't realize my co-host was crazy.
Okay, rewind. And years ago, I was growing more and more dissatisfied with traditional news outlets. They just were uninteresting, or they were too slanted, or felt like they were just maybe shallow. And I happened across this political commentator who day in and day out was so middle of the road. It was almost annoying at times, but I realized he was not going to cater to the left or to the right. He was his mission was to stay in the center. Now, it didn't mean you don't talk about things. And so what I found myself, what it did for me was, I can hear someone talk about issues on the right. I can hear someone talk about issues on the left.
Yep.
And you don't necessarily buy into the narrative, if there is one. You're simply having a conversation about this stuff. And I realized, that's actually way more interesting to be able to talk about any issue that's out there, but not do it in a way where you're trying to convince the other person of a certain viewpoint.
So you spent time not only examining the current landscape of news that was available, but being curious enough to act on finding a new source that would provide information that was helpful rather than maybe just, an agenda by the left or the right.
And I would say that's one of the biggest benefits to me in this regard, to being intellectually curious. It allows me to hear issues that I might not agree with otherwise, but I can hear them from a left-leaning perspective. I can hear them from a far-right perspective. And otherwise, I might initially or immediately resist or just not go there. But this has allowed me to really take in and hear different points of view where otherwise I just wouldn't hear them.
I think that being intellectually curious doesn't require, a lot of work. It just requires you to do some work. I think sometimes people think, they look down the road, where you're at now with your understanding of news and media, and they think, it's so much work to find that outlet and to, digest the information and take it in and to be able to discriminate rightly based upon my worldview, what information I should be taking in, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, no, you're not looking at, the person with, 2, 5, 10 years of experience and saying, how do I start there? That's so hard. You just start today And you have no idea where that's going to lead, because I think about, I love cooking, and I've cooked for years, but I didn't know how to cook really at all when I went to college. I knew basically nothing. And, I'd moved in with a family from my church, and the mother, one of the things that she was so gifted in was just throwing a million things into a pot or a pan or whatever, and an amazing dinner turned out. And I remember, this was probably sophomore year, maybe junior year of college, I was frustrated that I didn't know how to do that. I was how is it that you're able to just make amazing meals and you don't have a recipe? She would just grab random ingredients of whatever was in the fridge and it would turn into this amazing meal. And I was like, I want to know how to do that. Now, ironically, where I started was with no-bake cookies, which literally requires basically no skill. But then from there, fast forward 20 years later, I've now cooked, hundreds, probably thousands of meals. And now I'm very comfortable in a kitchen, and I'm very comfortable cooking without a recipe. And even if I have a recipe, I almost never follow it because the recipe's not right. I've got to make it better. And the only reason I know how to do all of that now is because I spent years being curious, learning from other chefs, from other women who knew how to cook well, from watching YouTube videos, from reading recipes, from trial and error myself. And I'm so thankful that I did that, because now today I can cook, so many different meals and bless a lot of people as part of the process.
And another example before we conclude, and this might have been partly financially motivated, was the brake pads on my car. I decided to have the brake pads replaced, and they have a nice little thing on the dash that tells you when the brake pads are low. So
Nice.
that's handy.
Total win.
So I asked the shop how much it's going to cost, and they give me a quote, and I thought, I could probably do it for a lot less than that. That was the going theory. Turns out, parts were like a quarter of the cost. But one thing leads to the next, and there's brake pad sensors, and there's clips, and you have to get a brake pad separator. There's this special tool that separates the caliper.
Interesting.
And so next thing you know, I got all these brand new tools.
Always a good thing.
Always a good thing. And, and I'm getting in there, and I had to figure this out, and I had to set the, plug something into the OBD port, release the e-brake. I mean, it was a whole process.
Wow.
And I kind of go down that road, and I'm like, hey, I'm going to figure this out. And the next thing you know, I got my wife asking me, hey, is this car safe to drive? But sure enough, it was very safe to drive, and it worked.
That's awesome. I love it. There's many examples that we could share from our lives, but we're going to conclude here. And there's two things we want you to do this week. Very simple. Number one, be more curious. Be more curious about the world around you, about the conversations you're having, the things you're reading, the things you're experiencing, and let that curiosity drive you to action to learn and know more. And number two, be aware that your natural inclination will be to avoid acting on that curiosity and to really opt out of learning more. Don't let that be your story, because trust me, you will become a much more interesting person, a much more valuable person to society, and a much more attractive person to women if you learn to be curious. As always, we love having you here on the Art of Pursuit podcast. We look forward to having you here next time.